welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I am really thrilled to have you here and to be introducing you to Sarah Casper. I want to tell you a little story of how I met Sarah. So many of you, I think, knew about or attended the Safe Parenting Summit back in February of this year. And during that summit, Sarah reached out to me because she was an attendee and said, hey, you and I should talk. And so we connected. We've had some great conversations, and it is my true pleasure to now host her on the Heartful Parent Podcast because, like me, Sarah talks about consent. We, do that in sort of different ways. She often works with kids. I don't. But she's got really awesome stuff to talk about. And the story that she's going to tell today about how she got into this line of work is fabulous and caught me totally by surprise. It's totally unexpected. In addition to the fabulous story she's about to tell you, though, Sarah is, as I said, a consent educator, and the name of her company that she founded is called Comprehensive Consent. She uses social emotional learning theory and practices and equips young people and their grown-ups with the knowledge and skills that they need to navigate body boundaries and create healthy relationships. After earning her BA in psychology at NYU, Sarah began her doctoral studies at Rutgers University on the path to becoming a clinical psychologist. Along the way, she discovered her true passion, and you're going to hear how she discovered that. But it really led her to helping people overcome the barriers to practicing consent and effective communication. And that's when she created Comprehensive Consent. Through her social media platforms, workshops, and curricula, Sarah has helped thousands of kids, adolescents, and adults deeply understand consent, improve their relationships, and become more prepared for the complexities of safe and ethical physical intimacy. This is a really fun conversation, and I know you're going to get so much out of it. So without further ado, Sarah. All right, Sarah, welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm really excited to have you here.
I'm very excited to be here.
So as I said in the introduction, you talk about consent. Like your whole professional life is about consent, which as a former prosecutor of sex crimes, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I should also say as a parent, right? As a prosecutor and as a parent, this is a topic I care deeply about, and frankly, don't think that enough parents are having this conversation because we all get lured into that idea of, well, not my kid. My kid would never do that. So I want to kind of start there and talk a little bit about like how you got into this line of work, and then how do we get over ourselves and the not my kid mentality.
Yeah. So how I got into this work is a very fun story because it has to do with partner acrobatics, which is usually not what someone's expecting to hear.
Oh, not what I expected you to say.
No. Yeah. I mean, there's the educational piece. My background's in psychology. I was in school to get my doctorate in clinical psych before I realized it wasn't for me. So that's the deeper foundation. But the heart of it comes from when I learned about partnered acrobatics, which is essentially rather than using a apparatus like trapeze or silks or a tightrope to perform your acrobatics, you're just using yourself and other people's bodies.
Okay.
I got into this back in 2017. I took a class because my brother's friend was teaching it, and it was so fun for me.
Like, this is the kind of stuff we see in Cirque du Soleil, right? Like,
I sometimes say it's like Cirque du Soleil light.
Okay.
It's very light.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's the building blocks of that. Absolutely.
Okay. Super cool.
Yeah. And I took this class, I fell in love with it, and I continued to practice it. And one day I'm sitting in the park with some friends and we're doing some partner acrobatics, acro yoga, all the same thing. We're doing some acro. And all of a sudden I'm like, you guys, the rules of acro are the same as the rules of sex. And they're like, Sarah, what are you saying? And I was like, well, there's like excitement, but there's also risk. And you're navigating your body with another person's body. And how you feel about practicing one day is not the same as how you feel practicing the next day. And what you do with one person is going to be different than what you do with the other person. And there's power dynamics. If a teacher asks you to do something, if someone who's more skilled asks you to do something, there's assumptions about bodies, whose body should work with whose body.
Right.
And navigating that. And I just started making all these connections and seeing also at the same time how the reason I was able to make all these connections is because I learned how to navigate my body through acro yoga. I learned how to say, ouch, that hurts. I need something different. And hey, can we try this? And no, I don't want to do that, in this lower stakes environment that had nothing to do with sex, but had everything to do with navigating my body in a way that felt comfortable, safe, and also fun.
Yes.
And I was like, what if we can do this with kids? What if we can make it so you're not learning about sex? That's where the, educational background in psychology comes in, learning generalizable skills that aren't about sex, but are just about navigating your body in a way that feels good and is respectful.
Okay. I have to say, like, my mind just kind of went like mind blown, because you're totally right. And I never would look at two people doing, maybe this isn't what it really is, but like you see people on America's Got Talent or whatever, doing these kinds of acrobatic things. Right. And you're totally right. Like, now that I think about that, having seen people do that, it is everything you described. There's the risk, there's the excitement, there's the, touch me here, don't touch me there, right? Because that's going to hurt or that's not going to hurt. I mean, what an incredible kind of parallel to draw in that moment. And then to say, what if we could talk about this in a non-sexual way?
Mm-hmm.
Because people freak out when we get talking about sex, right?
Yep.
Especially it feels like in an increased way in our country these days.
Yeah. But if you look at it through this lens, it's not about sex. It's about navigating your body and your body boundaries and the things that your body wants to do and doesn't want to do. And we do that. Sure, we do that. We do that in sex. We do that in acro yoga or partnered acrobatics, if you're someone who does that. But we also do that when two kids are play wrestling, or when you're having a tickle fight with your kid, or when you're like jumping on your friend's back to like scare them in the middle of the hallway in school because you're just being playful. It's the same. It's again, like generalizable skills, navigating body boundaries, just in these different contexts. And so we can practice them when the stakes are low, so we're prepared when the stakes are high.
I mean, that is such an incredible concept, because especially as I heard you describe it, and it sounds like, you were an adult when you started doing this, right? And you said that's how you learned to navigate your body and to say, I like this, I don't like this, this hurts, this doesn't hurt. And I have to say, there's a part of me that makes me really sad about that, right? Because especially, and I don't want to exclude, boys, men, people who identify as male from this, but I think societally, girls and women identifying folks we are not taught to understand our bodies, to say this is okay and this isn't okay. We're simply taught not to make waves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that you were an adult, and I think many of us were adults when we learned that, maybe not through partner acrobatics, but, and there are many adults who still don't know how to do that.
And I think the community element was such a big part of that, because as someone, I'm 5'3" and I weigh about 170 pounds. So I am not the ideal base, the bottom person holding people up. And I'm also not the, again, quote unquote, ideal flyer, the person up in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't know where I belonged in this space. I didn't know what my role was supposed to be. And I had community saying, well, what do you want to do? And I was like, what do you mean? What do I want to do? It's like, what am I supposed to do? What am I allowed to do? And they're like, well, first start with what do you want to do? And I had friends who were like encouraging me to, if I wanted to fly on someone who was my size, that we could give it a try and do it if both of us were into it. And so I had support in asking for what I want. If I was like, ooh, I'm not sure if I want to do this or not, I had community that was saying, do you want to scaffold this? So we'll try it at a lower level and then move up to this. Do you want to not do it at all? Do you want to watch me do it with someone else? And then you can see what it looks like. So I had community there, which is something that you can have in schools, that environment, and in homes with parents, encouraging kids to figure it out, rather than when you're an adult and you're in a bedroom with one person and you're not having most likely someone to help you navigate that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go back to my mind is kind of blown right now, because this is totally not the story that I expected you to tell about how you got into teaching consent. And I love this story. So, and I love that idea of teaching this in lower stake environments, right? As you said, like the kids walking down the hall in school, playing on the playground, play wrestling. I mean, I could see this coming in sports to some degree, right? In cheerleading and, whatever. So how can we as parents, or, I think there are educators who listen to this podcast as well, or people like me who are both parents and educators, how can we start looking for finding those kind of situations? And then how do we turn that into a teaching moment where our kids aren't just like, oh my God, mom, shut up.
Right. The reason that I think that, oh my God, mom, eye roll thing happens is often because it does feel very didactic, and like it is a parent bestowing knowledge onto child, as opposed to parent kind of modeling and empowering child in what to do. So there does need to be some, didactics of like, you need to ask first. Here is why. Here's what to do if you want to say no, right? We need some of that, but we also need a parent who, when someone's invited for a sleepover and the kid doesn't want to go, that they're saying, okay, are you open to talking about why that is? If you don't want to go, that's okay. And, it might be, if you don't want to go, that's okay. And then eventually it might lead to a place where they feel comfortable opening up to why. But setting that groundwork of, I want you to feel what it feels like not to have to do something.
Yeah.
And if they want to invite someone for a sleepover and the person says no to them, it's not, I'm sure they'll say yes another time. They probably had a good reason. It can be that. But in addition to, and it's okay if they just weren't in the mood, that's totally okay. In fact, if they never want to sleep over, right, that's okay. Just like there are some things you never want to do and it's not a reflection on you.
Yeah.
But actually verbalizing that people making their own choices, it's okay. And we might have expectations and we might be let down, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But I think that support of a child in making their own decisions is so important. And then also making sure that you as a parent are also modeling that same thing.
Yes.
So, right. Yeah.
As you're telling that story or talking about that, it reminded me of a story with my older daughter. So my older daughter will turn 14 this summer, and she was invited to a birthday party sleepover. I don't know when, or earlier in this school year. And she was really excited to go and, really excited to be there. I had never been to this family's home before. And I did all the, asking questions about, who's going to be there, what are they going to be doing, et cetera, sort of satisfied my own, safety things. And I got a call from my daughter actually she texted me and said, Mom, I've changed my mind. I don't want to stay over here. Mm-hmm. She still, adored her friend, but there was just the family dynamics or whatever was going on. It didn't feel good to her. And in that moment, I was in bed. I was in my pajamas. I was ready to go to sleep. And I could have easily said, tough it out, kid, man, you're there. You said you wanted to go. You told your friend you were going to go. Like, you got to stick with the decision that you made. Right. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of parents that could say that. And I didn't. And I said, I will be there. I contacted the parent. I said, hey, I'm coming to get my kiddo. And I went and got her at 11 o'clock at night. And then I had to navigate that with this parent, not to toot my own horn, but like, as you described that scenario, I'm like, okay, that is a great example of when I was able to send that message to my daughter. You do not have to stay. You do get to change your mind in the middle of a decision if it doesn't feel good to you.
Absolutely. I'll toot your horn.
Okay.
I'll toot your horn 100%. Yeah. That it's okay. So it wasn't what you expected to be, or something happened. And also for situations where, let's say she was going to be away, so you're away and you really can't pick her up. You can still be there and support and say, I'm not here. What can we do? I can either have aunt blah, 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 pick you up and stay through the night. We can figure out something together. And if you are a parent who in the past has said, toughen it out, you can actually go to your child and say, hey, when you were at that sleepover last month and you called me, I said this thing and I wish I had responded differently, because the truth is you can change your mind whenever you want. So even if you are in a situation, so parents, especially of like teens and tweens who have encountered things like this in the past, where now they're listening and they're thinking, I might have sent some messages I didn't want to send.
Yeah.
That's where repair comes in.
Yes. I'm so glad that you said that, because I'm a big believer that there's a lot of power in not just getting it right the first time, but making the repairs when we do something we didn't intend to do, that models something really important for our kids as well.
Absolutely. In fact, it is so important to not be quote unquote perfect, because we need to model. We need to have opportunities to model what to do when you mess up.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And as a self-confessed, I don't like making mistakes very much, because there was messaging when I was growing up that wasn't okay. This has been a learning process for me to make those repairs. And it has also been such a great way to connect with my kids, which I know we could have a whole separate conversation about, the importance of those genuine, sincere apologies when we do screw something up. But I want to kind of circle back to this idea of using these low stakes places, right? Sleepover in the situation that I described was a low stakes scenario. I recognize that there are sleepovers that may not be as low stakes. Right. Want to acknowledge that. In this particular situation, it was low stakes. What are other ways that parents can kind of use, whatever's going on in our daily lives with our kids to help reinforce that idea of getting to decide what you do with your body, and making sure that what's being done with your body feels good to you?
Anytime you have a chance to encourage your child to slow down before making a decision, that is key, because that will give them not just practice in either saying yes, saying no, checking in, whatever, but also practice in paying attention to how their body feels. Again, in a stakes environment. It's time to decide what you want from the menu. You have to make a decision. We're at the restaurant, the waiter's here, right? You can say, we can call the waiter back. Take your time. Think, close your eyes. Think about what sounds good to your body right now and make that decision that way, right? Not making the decision because you're coloring and you're delaying making the decision,
right?
Not that kind of thing, but the actual you can pause and how do you really feel? And whatever answer you come up with is, okay, do you want to go to that sleepover? You have the parent on the phone now, but that doesn't mean the kid has to decide now.
Right. Right.
They can take the time to say, oh, right, when I have a decision in front of me, I'm allowed to pause. I get in the habit of pausing is definitely one thing that parents can do. And that is true for kids of all ages.
That is such a powerful recommendation. And I'm like thinking through my own, like I sometimes feel probably rushed to make decisions faster than I would like to. So that's something I could probably model, a little better for my daughters than I might be doing, and encouraging them to do that as well. We don't take a pause often enough in our lives in general, right?
It's so counterintuitive.
Yeah, it really is. So as we look at these situations and we are encouraging our kids to take pauses and, kind of looking for opportunities in their just regular life to ask maybe like, well, what feels good to you right now? At what point should we, if ever, draw the really hard and fast link between decision-making on a menu at a restaurant and decision-making about what you want to do sexually? Because, you talked about that sort of, we don't want to be too didactic. We don't want to be just teaching our kids. And let's be honest, we love to do that because we're so wise. Right?
I do have all the answers. I don't know if you.
Of course, I do too. It's so weird because I do too. At what point is it appropriate to start drawing those really concrete links for them?
I think that partially depends on what your child is learning in school. So if they're having those conversations in school, then, that might be a time to do that. But if your child is already understanding, slowing down, checking in with the other person, knowing it's okay to say no, knowing it's okay to hear a no, the line almost doesn't have to be drawn. It's just an extension. It's, of course, this isn't something separate. I'm not learning something new when I learn consent for sex. I'm just learning how the same thing I've always done applies to this situation. It applies to tickling when I was 3. It applies to play wrestling when I was 8. It applies to being on the couch with my girlfriend when I'm 13. And there should still be conversation about the stakes, but in terms of like how to interact in those situations, they are the same. If you're already asking about how something feels, and if someone wants to do something, you don't need to do anything differently.
Yeah.
You need to remember that the stakes are higher, right? The stakes are higher when you're driving. Let's say I live in New York City. There's city bike, there's e-bikes, and there's regular bikes, right? The stakes are higher when I'm riding an e-bike because it goes faster. Right. But I still do the same thing where I'm slowing down when I get to an intersection. I'm looking both ways. I might want to be extra careful. I might take different precautions in terms of how sure I am that I've looked both ways, maybe. It's the same thing. So yeah, you might double check on and ask, is this still okay? But the fundamentals are already there. And that's exactly what I'm hoping to teach and get out in my work for parents and kids to understand that if you teach this in low stakes, everyday environments, it will come naturally in those higher stakes environments. It's not.
I love that. Well, and it just feels so much more manageable, I think, for many parents to teach that in a wrestling situation rather than, I'm a big believer that at some point, yes, we do need to be talking to kids about sex and all of that stuff, right? Of course. And I know you agree with that. But as an intro into this, or kind of like the stepping stones to be just talking about this in really everyday ways, feels not as scary for many parents.
I will often say, I actually don't like using the word consent with kids because that word has so many connotations and doesn't actually provide, I find, helpful information, right? You need to get consent for a hug. Saying that to a 5-year-old, you need permission to borrow a toy. You need permission for a hug. You need, it's everyday language that they can make sense of and incorporate easily. That, now we've gotten to where we now are calling it consent because of, again, the stakes and what the activity is, but it's all the same things we've already been learning.
Yeah.
And been doing.
Well, and I often think, consent is such a low bar, right? When we think, so there's an educator, consent educator out there, Mike Domish, you might be familiar with his work, but he talks about, when I was speaking with him for the Safe Parenting Summit this last year, he's like, if you asked any married person, like, is the bar for your marriage that it's consensual, right? That my husband had consent to marry me. I mean, no, like I wanted us both showing up enthusiastic and excited about getting married, right? And so when we think about consent as the standard that we should all be meeting, I mean, what a crappy world that would be in, right? If we were just consenting to be in our marriages or our friendships or our sexual relationships. Like, I think we all deserve better than that.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Louder for the people in the back. Yeah. So, right. So why do we need to incorporate this word consent? Instead, we can use things like, is this something you want to do? Say that to a child. Do you want to hug grandma? Not do you give grandma consent for a hug?
Right.
We can use the language so the values are internalized in a way that just, it's how they interact with all people all the time, ideally, or that they understand that is, how they should be acting with people.
Yeah, I love that idea. I know I've heard you say, like, legally consent is something that that's a legal concept, right? Mm-hmm. And as a lawyer, like we do have legal definitions for consent in every state. And again, going back to what we were just saying, like that really, for something to be legal, what should be the bare minimum here that we're setting for ourselves. So as our kids get older, because I love the idea of, do you want to hug grandma? Is that something that you want? Do you want to sit on, daddy's lap or, whatever it is? Of course, my daughter would be like, yes, I do want to eat a cookie instead of my chicken. All right. Okay, well, let's talk about that. But, just thinking about that from what your body wants, what you want. As our kids get older and we hit those tween and teen years, we start to have less influence, right? Because they're in this process of individuation. We start to have less control over all of the external messaging that they're getting. I can no longer just say, well, you're only allowed to watch Bluey on TV, which is like what my kindergartner watches, but that's obviously quite different than what my almost 14-year-old is seeing and being exposed to. How do we as parents elevate this conversation, or maybe escalates even the word, to start addressing or counteracting, I guess, these really intense cultural messages that get more and more intense as they get older? Anything from a billboard to a rom-com to online hardcore pornography.
At that age, teens and tweens want to be right. They want to prove their parents wrong. It's part of the individuation. So I like to offer parents a game where the parent and the child take turns setting up scenarios where if I'm the parent, I'm setting up a scenario where I'm like, okay, so you're at this friend's house. They're a grade older than you. You've never kissed before. You're in their bed, whatever. You set up this scenario and this happens. Like, what would you do? Or like, what should you do?
Uh-huh.
And the kid answers it, but then the kid gets to challenge parent back and say, okay, well, here's the scenario. And like, you don't have to say you can, make up names, Julia, Max, whatever, because even saying you and I can make it a lot heavier.
Yeah.
So Julia's doing this and Mark is doing that, but they've both been drinking. Like, what should they do? And then you can even build to it and say, okay, so they shouldn't do anything. And it's like, well, what if they already did? Right. Mm-hmm. So you're challenging each other in a way that engages the child, because you're not saying I have all the answers. You're saying these are tricky scenarios to navigate, and consent often is context dependent. I talk about how my dad gets home from work, kisses my mom, doesn't ask.
Right.
That's totally okay with me. That's totally okay with them.
Right.
That is so different than you're at a party and you're drinking and you've never met this person before. So you can kind of start to develop their critical thinking skills. Think of like, okay, what factors impact this scenario? And there's no, some of the time there is a right answer, but some of the time it's, okay, so that's what I would do. What would you do? Or what do you think about my answer? And what maybe are you missing, or what? And also, often like assumptions are made. You'll find out that there's, oh, well, I assume that they were dating. Like, oh, I assume they weren't dating. That's why we had different answers. Why does dating impact it? And so, especially if you start, it allows the child to critically think. It allows you as the parent to critically think about this. And in a way where, again, it's not, I'm telling you what to do. It's, I want to think what you would do in this scenario because I'm not sure. And to start it off, you can often use like movies as like a jumping off point. Like, I don't like that character did that. I would have done this. What would you have done?
I love that. So I have often said, like, you can use movies or whatever, but you're taking it one step further, which is not just saying, hey, I don't like what happened there, and here's why, which is that kind of lecture-y, didactic approach, but taking it further and saying, what do you think they should have done, or what would you have done in that situation? First of all, I know that's going to be more engaging for a teenager who they're real good at tuning us out real quick if they're not somehow actively engaged in that conversation, right? That's just so lovely. And when I talk about from a safety standpoint, playing what if games with little kids, like what if a man drove up or was in the park and said, I have a trunk load of puppies. Do you want to come see the puppies? Like, what would you do? Right. Yep. And that's not really one where we're challenging each other back and forth, because there is a right answer to that question. But when you get into these complicated relational things, as you just described, there aren't always super clear answers. But so this would be like a nice extension of that earlier practice with young kids into, okay, now you're older, I'm perhaps less worried about you looking at the puppies in the trunk that aren't really there, and more concerned about what's happening when you are in, by yourself with your boyfriend or girlfriend and their parents aren't home and they, want to do something like, I could just see any infinite number of scenarios that you could paint and say, what would you do?
Right. Or again, what would Julie do? What do you think you should do? Again, it helps. There can be a mix, but it can often, again, especially when kids are like resistant to engage, it sounds like, oh, this is a teaching moment, as opposed to this is like, it almost makes it like a philosophical, ethical conversation, which they want to engage in because I'm right, you're wrong. So it's another way to just like tickle their brain in a way that is interesting to where they are developmentally.
You know what I also like about this is it circles us back to one of the very first questions that I asked, which is, how do we get over ourselves and this idea of not my kid? And this just enables us to have these conversations in a way that empowers our kids and might also allow them to keep an eye out for their friends, right? What's going on around them, especially when we do it like you just said, like what should Julie do? That gets us out of our own brains of thinking my child would or wouldn't do, right? And it just enables us to kind of engage and have conversation about it.
At the end of the day, that's my goal with my work, is to not get people to ask for consent, because as you said, the bar is so low, and that doesn't actually, getting consent, getting a yes doesn't mean that harm won't be caused. So that's not my ultimate mission. My ultimate mission is to build empathy, compassion, and critical thinking. What do I do in this situation, given these factors? How often do I need to check in? What do I need to ask? What conversations do I need to have before? Do I need to have a conversation about STI testing? Do I need to, right? I want to engage the part in the brain so that they're ready for any scenario, not just so that they know to get a yes.
Sarah, that is like the most perfect place to end our conversation. We could talk for hours about this, but that just really sums everything up so, so beautifully. and I hope that's a takeaway for people that are listening to this. Where can people find you and the work that you are doing?
I am quite active on my Instagram account, which is at Comprehensive Consent. You can also find me at comprehensiveconsent.com. Reach out to me via email, direct message. Great. In 2024, fingers crossed, I will have a curriculum for 7 to 13-year-olds on consent skills coming out. So that's super exciting that that's being published.
When that is coming out, we will get you back on the podcast to talk about that. That would be incredible. And in the meantime, we'll put all your contact info, your Instagram in the show notes that people can access, because I know you've got a lot of great stuff out there already. And I mean, as I said, like, you just wrapped up that sort of the idea of what we're trying to do here and what we should all be trying to do here with our kids and the other kids that we are in relationship with, our children's friends, our nieces, nephews, whoever it might be. Sarah, thank you so much for being here and sharing your wisdom. I love that this partner acrobatics led you here, and that you discovered a fun hobby and also this way to help change the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for the work you're doing and for having me on. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, listeners, I hope you loved that conversation as much as I do. Sarah and I both work in similar spaces, but I love talking to other practitioners because we all approach it ever so slightly differently. And when I hear, someone like Sarah share the way she thinks about it or teaches it, there's little light bulbs that go off in my own head, even though I also work in the same space. So that was really fun for me. I hope you enjoyed it. In our show notes, you can find all the different ways to reach out to Sarah. She's got great content out there, and we will definitely have her back on the podcast when her curricula is up for those 7 to 13-year-olds that's coming in 2024. Until next week, have a fabulous week and happy parenting.